Well, it's closing time here in John Kay's bookshop, but since a bookseller never sleeps, I've got time to recommend one last book of the day, and it's this book, Scotland by Stuart Kelly. It's a book about the life, works, and legacy of Walter Scott, which is a subject very pertinent for me as a bookseller in Edinburgh. I have a lot of tourists and customers who are interested in finding out more about Walter Scott, but quite unsure of where to start. Unlike Burns and Stevenson, where there are more obvious starting places and more easily accessible texts, Scott is a little bit of a more daunting prospect. For starters, the 30-odd novels that he produced give off the impression of being a sequence that you have to read from start to finish. If you see them in older editions, they might either be numbered or collected into one massive volume. And because they were published anonymously, they announced themselves as a kind of Waverley franchise, by the author of Waverley, they said, not by Walter Scott. In his day, when he was producing these novels with phenomenal industry, he was called the Great Unknown. After Scott had died and his popularity had fallen off a cliff, his biographer W.E.K. Anderson said that the Great Unknown became the Great Unread. Stuart Kelly tells the story of that extreme peak and pitch in Walter Scott's popularity. I thought this book was fantastic. I thought it was so well done. I was so continually impressed at how well it trod the line between being a work of popular literary nonfiction and a book of real intelligence too. That might sound needlessly patronizing, but there's a lot of popular literary nonfiction books that come across rather chummy, rather pleading. So they are so desperate to make the case that their subject that they want to reappraise is cool and accessible, that there's a bit of a down with the kids vibe, or there's an effort to try and make it terribly relatable. Stuart Kelly does none of that. He is openly aiming at a general readership. It's his ambition to rehabilitate Scott and get him back on the bookshelves, but he does so without compromising an ounce of intelligence. It's a book that wears its intelligence and research really, really lightly. It's a breezy book, and the breezy wit of the book is not only a delight to read, but it really adds to the book's argument that Walter Scott is not dry as dust. In a sense, it's a biography of Scott. It kind of goes chronologically through his life, but each chapter is more like an aspect of Scott. It's almost like each chapter is a short, sharp little shard of a smashed stained glass, which you can piece back together into the cathedral, colossus of Scott. Now, as the title implies, it is also a study of Scotland, both the real country and the imagined nation that Walter Scott invented so successfully that it began to spill out. His imagined Scotland spilled out and began to colour the reality of Scotland and Scotland's history. It was Robert Louis Stevenson's opinion that Scotland is indefinable. It has no unity except on a map, he said. And that has been one of the recurring stories in Scottish literature. A long-held anxiety about language, a sense of being overshadowed by the English neighbours, as seen in modelling Burns as a Scottish bard to match Shakespeare, the Bard of England, as seen in resentments about the Scottish play, Macbeth, which we've talked about on the channel recently. The play that is known as the Scottish play, humiliatingly written by an English playwright. As seen too in the poems of Ossian, as supposedly discovered by James Macpherson, this triumphant discovery of a Homeric Scottish legend, this wellspring of Scottish legends, which, as Kelly says in the book, were the most successful vision of Scottishness as yet discovered, and yet turned out to be a fake. Into this atmosphere of fogginess and lack of a foundation enters Walter Scott and says, there's nothing as easy as inventing a tradition. Scotland's history would be as Scott made it, and he wouldn't let reality get in the way. Sometimes that came back to haunt him, as recounted in this entertaining passage about his poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. Scott himself was always wry about certain imaginative aspects of the poem. The lines on Melrose Abbey, "If thou wouldst view fair Melrose aright, go visit it by the pale moonlight, for the gay beams of lightsome day gild but the flout, the ruins grey," he disavowed. "I had been guilty of sending many persons a bat hunting to see the ruins of Melrose by moonlight, which I never saw myself," he wrote. He was asked to copy the speech in autograph for a friend and change the final lines of Canto 2, stanza 1, from "Then go, but go alone the while, and view St. David's ruined pile, and home returning soothly swear was never seen so sad and fair," to Then go and meditate with awe on scenes the author never saw, who never wandered by the moon to see what they could be seen by noon. Even in this piece of innocuous picturesque, the overlapping of real Scotland and Scotland, the literary projection and the historical manifestation, grate and become problematic. Above all, as anyone who has seen the Abbey can vouchsafe, the stones, whether in moonlight or lightsome day, are quite clearly red, not grey. The book is full of entertaining little asides like that. Kelly steps between history and literary criticism, giving you a really great overview of some of the major novels by Scott. It's not a long enough book, obviously, to analyse one by one, but you will come away with a really good grounding of where to start with Scott to begin with, but also the critical reputation of his major works, as well as a sense of what a strange and melancholic figure Scott was in Kelly's view, as he shows how by converting Scotland into an imaginary place, Scott made himself an imaginary author. This is backed up by one of his first biographers, not quite his first, his son-in-law. This is one of his most famous biographers, J.G. Lockhart, who, referring to him as Scott referred to himself as the Wizard of the North, or the Great Northern Wizard, said he became a dupe of his own delusions in the end, which is, of course, the traditional fate of wizards, to be eventually overcome by their own powers. And Scott had more reason than most to believe in the transformative power of his wizardry. And to give you a couple of examples of the imaginary Scotland spilling over into the real Scotland, first of all, you have the King's Jaunt, the visit of George IV to Edinburgh, supervised and organised by Scott, in which he repackaged the Hanoverian monarch George as a kind of returning Jacobite king. It's an interesting aspect of Scott's identity that Kelly goes into in some depth, of him being both a patriot, a Scottish patriot, and a unionist. And then the other example of Scotland made real, brought to life, is his home, Abbotsford, a kind of neo-medieval castle that he built. Which I think is described as his tragic flaw in this book. A stately home intended as a monument to Scottish history, but not so much Scottish history as Scottish history, but which ended up being more like a camp mausoleum to a Scotland that never really existed. Anyway, that's just a taste of this book. Highly recommended. And we have it in stock here in the bookshop, so if you're local and you fancy a copy, drop on by.